In just 7 minutes on the Senate floor, J.D. Vance did what no one expected. He revealed the secret deal Sherrod Brown never wanted America to see. Before millions watching live, the truth shattered the polished image of a trusted senator and exposed a betrayal that shook the nation's faith in its leaders. This wasn't just another political debate. It was the moment when promises were stripped bare, when hidden contracts surfaced, and when the people's voice found its champion. Imagine the weight in that room, the gasps, the stunned silence, the eyes of workers who had been forgotten for decades, now finally seeing justice unfold right before them. J.D. Vance stood not for applause but for truth, and as the cameras rolled, history was made. Before we begin this powerful journey, a word of reflection. While the events you're about to witness are dramatized and fictional, they echo real struggles, real hopes, and real disappointments that Americans have felt. Our story is inspired by those truths, because sometimes fiction helps us see reality more clearly. Now let's step into that chamber and face the truth behind the promises. Because what happens next is more than a story. It's a mirror to our times. There are places in America where time doesn't just move forward, it abandons. J.D. Vance stepped out of his truck onto cracked asphalt, the air thick with the scent of rust and old rain. Before him stood what was left of Harding Steelworks, once the heartbeat of this Ohio town, now a skeleton of girders and shattered glass, its name barely visible under decades of grime. The last time a furnace glowed here, J.D. had been a boy no older than 10. The silence of the mill now felt heavier than the roar of machinery ever had. He walked slowly, boots crunching over broken concrete and weeds that clawed through the ground like nature reclaiming what industry had forsaken. The wind whispered through hollow window frames, rattling loose panels. Each sound seemed like a voice from the past. A worker's shout, a hammer's strike, a whistle signaling the end of a shift. But no one was coming out. No one had for years. J.D. paused at what had once been the main gate, his hand brushing the rusted chain that sealed it shut. In his mind, he saw his father. Denim jacket dark with sweat, boots scuffed from long hours, walking through that gate for the last time. He remembered the day too clearly. The sky had been the same pale gray, the air heavy with the storm that never came, and his mother's tears when his father set down his lunch pail at home, silent, defeated. J.D. had learned that day that a man could lose his job, and with it, a part of himself, without a single word exchange. He moved deeper into the ruins, past fallen beams and graffiti that mocked what once stood tall. The ground was littered with remnants, a broken hard hat, a twisted metal tool, a time card half buried in dirt. Every step stirred up the scent of oil and ash, like ghosts clinging to what was theirs. But it wasn't just memory that haunted this place. J.D. wasn't alone. A group of older men stood near the collapsed loading dock, their faces lined with time and loss. They had gathered, as they did some mornings, not to work, but to remember. One man, Frank, nodded to J.D., recognizing the boy who used to watch through the fence as his father worked. His voice, when it came, was low and rough. "We built this town, and they sold it for scrap." The others muttered their agreement, voices thick with a bitterness that never dulled. They spoke of promises made and broken, foreign contracts and politicians' smiles that vanished after Election Day. J.D. listened, heart heavy, as Frank pointed to the empty rail tracks beyond. "Steel left on those rails, and so did our pride." J.D. knelt, picking up a bolt blackened by time. The weight of it in his hand felt like the weight of their stories. Heavy, real, impossible to ignore. He looked at the men, at the mill, at the town beyond where houses sagged and windows boarded up, stared blankly at the street. He thought of the kids growing up here now, wondering what future they'd have to fight for. And in that moment, a question formed in his mind, a question that wouldn't let go. Who had traded these men's futures away? And why had no one answered for it? J.D. rose, dusted off his hands, and gazed back at the mill one last time. The ghosts of steel towns didn't just haunt these streets, they haunted the halls of power. And J.D. Vance was about to walk into those halls, not with a speech prepared, but with the weight of these stories in his bones. JD's boots were still dusty from the mill's ruins when he returned to his modest office in DC, but his mind hadn't left Harding or the men whose lives had been left in tatters. As he sank into his chair, the weight of their voices echoed louder than the chatter of staffers in the hallway or the hum of the city beyond. His gaze fell on a folded copy of the American Steel and Worker Protection Act, the bill that was supposed to give those forgotten towns a fighting chance. On paper, it looked promising: tax incentives for domestic steel, penalties for companies shipping jobs overseas, funding for community retraining programs. But JD knew better than to trust promises inked in neat paragraphs. He had seen too many grand ideas become hollow gestures by the time they reached the people who needed them most. And then came the voice, Sherrod Brown's voice, smooth as polished steel and twice as practiced, rang out from the small TV perched on JD's shelf. There he was, standing at the Senate podium, suit crisp, expression confident, speaking with that trademark certainty that made headlines and won votes. Sherrod called the bill misguided, short-sighted, dangerous for the modern economy. His tone was measured, but his words cut deep. He spoke of global competitiveness, of partnerships abroad, of how America needed to look forward, not backward. The chamber gave polite nods, some even clapped. The camera panned the room, catching faces that JD knew too well, faces that smiled for the cameras, but avoided looking too long at a man who spoke for the towns they'd rather forget. JD leaned forward, studying Sherrod's eyes, his stance, the slight curl of his lip when he mentioned the past. Something felt off. The words were perfect, almost too perfect, as if rehearsed not for truth, but for effect. JD thought of Frank, of the steel bolt heavy in his palm, of the empty rail lines that once carried the lifeblood of the town to the world. Sherrod's speech didn't match that reality. It didn't carry the weight of the mills, the heartbreak of fathers and sons who had lost more than paychecks. It didn't speak to the towns where hope was now a memory, not a future. And in that disconnect, JD felt the first stirrings of a truth that demanded to be uncovered. As Sherrod's speech ended and the cameras cut away, JD sat back, heart heavy, but mind sharper than ever. He could see the battle lines forming, not just in Congress but across the nation. On one side were men like Sherrod, polished and persuasive, speaking of progress while turning blind eyes to the wreckage left behind. On the other were the towns JD had walked, the people whose voices were lost beneath layers of policy and politics. JD felt the call rising in him, not as a politician, but as a son of those forgotten streets. He knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. It would mean facing powerful interests, questioning allies, risking his own future. But as he stared at that folded bill and thought of the ghosts of Harding Steelworks, he knew he didn't have a choice. The battle had already begun the moment he stepped onto that cracked asphalt. Now it was time to carry their fight into the chamber where promises lived and died. The debate was set. The Senate announced it with little fanfare, a date and time added to the official calendar. But across Ohio, it felt like a bell tolling before battle. JD Vance stood at his office window as the Capitol dome glowed in the early dusk, its pale light stark against a sky heavy with gathering clouds. Inside, his desk was buried under stacks of reports, manila folders with dog-eared corners, pages marked with notes scrawled in pencil and ink, highlighted lines that leapt out as warnings and promises. He had read them all, again and again, hunting for the threads of truth woven between statistics and spin. The American Steel and Worker Protection Act, dry words on paper that, to JD, carried the weight of every handshake he'd shared in Harding, every story of a lost home or shuttered shop. His hands, tired but steady, turned each page with care, as if the answers he sought might be hidden in the margins. The night deepened. Beyond the glass, DC pulsed with its usual rhythm, headlights tracing the avenues, voices rising faintly from bars where deals were whispered and promises exchanged. But JD's office was quiet, save for the scratch of his pen, the shuffle of paper, and the steady beat of his heart loud in his ears. He paused now and then, eyes lingering on numbers that told of jobs lost, plants closed, wages hollowed out. These weren't just figures in a report. They were names, faces, families, towns whose future had been signed away by hands that would never bear the scars of the work those people had done. Across Ohio, the stage was setting in its own way. In union halls where photos of past strikes lined the walls, workers gathered around old televisions, their folding chairs pulled close like soldiers around a campfire. In small-town bars, men and women nursed cheap beers, their eyes fixed on the screens above the counter, waiting for someone to speak a truth they'd almost stopped believing in. In living rooms where curtains hung thin against winter drafts, families sat together, children hushed by the tension in their parents' faces, the weight of unspoken hopes. They would all be watching, not just the debate, but for a sign that someone, at last, would fight for them. Back in his office, JD closed the final folder, his fingers tracing the worn edge, as if feeling the cost of what was to come. He knew the numbers, the arguments, the politics. He knew the risks. He had seen the eyes of colleagues glance away when he spoke of Harding, felt the polite dismissals that came when the forgotten towns were mentioned. He knew Sherrod Brown would come armed with data, with polished speeches and practiced charm, but JD would come with something else. The weight of empty mills, of broken promises, of a people who still believed in the idea that truth, spoken plainly, could move a nation. He rose, his joints stiff from hours at the desk, and moved back to the window. The city stretched before him, the capital standing watch like a monument to both what America had been and what it might still become. J.D. Vance stood there for a long moment, his reflection faint against the glass, eyes on the dome, on the storm clouds gathering beyond it. The stage was set, the hour was coming, and J.D. felt it. The weight of it all, heavy on his shoulders but steady in his resolve. The fight wasn't tomorrow. The fight had already begun. The chamber was full, but the air felt rehearsed. Sherrod Brown took the floor with the ease of a man who had done this 100 times before. His suit was immaculate, his notes crisp, his voice measured and warm in a way that played well on camera. He began with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, thanking his colleagues for their time, for their service, for their commitment to what he called a forward-looking America. Then he launched into his speech, polished like a speechwriter's draft, each word placed just so. He spoke of smart trade and modern economy, of global competitiveness and partnerships that secure our future. His hands moved as he spoke, subtle gestures underscoring his points, his tone calm but confident. He invoked charts and studies, surveys that showed promise, partnerships that positioned America as a leader on the world stage. He framed the American Steel and Worker Protection Act as a well-meaning misstep. Protectionist, outdated, dangerous in a modern age where, as he put it, we must innovate, not insulate. Senators nodded. Cameras zoomed in on faces that smiled and approved, or at least appeared to. From the gallery, the speech looked like success, a masterclass in political finesse. But far beyond the chamber, in union halls, bars, and living rooms, something felt off. Sherrod's words were smooth, but they rang hollow where reality lived. The men and women watching had heard this song before. Promises of better tomorrows that never arrived, dressed in the language of progress. His speech was for headlines, not for them. Then J.D. Vance rose, slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of what he was about to say demanded respect for the moment. He didn't glance at prepared notes. There were none. His hands gripped the podium, knuckles pale. His voice, when it came, was steady but raw. The voice of a man who spoke not for applause, but because silence was no longer an option. J.D. didn't start with numbers or charts. He started with a name. Harrison Mills, he said quietly. A town many in that room had never visited, and perhaps never would. Population, 3,200, give or take, a steel town, or it was. The chamber grew stiller, the murmurs fading as his words found their mark. J.D. told of the factory that had been the town's heartbeat, shuttered after a flood of cheap imports undercut prices until survival was no longer possible. He spoke of the Friday when the whistles blew for the last time, and fathers walked home to their families carrying empty lunch pails. He spoke of the boy who watched his father that day, a boy who learned too young what it meant when work and dignity were stolen in the same breath. J.D.'s eyes swept the room, resting on faces that now seemed less certain. less composed. That boy was me. There were no charts, no surveys, no smooth catchphrases, just a single truth laid bare in front of a chamber that had too often looked away. The contrast was stark. Where Sherrod spoke of theory, JD spoke of lives. Where Sherrod painted with broad strokes of progress, JD drew a single searing line straight to the heart. In union halls, bars, and homes, people leaned closer, sensing that, for once, someone was speaking their language. The Senate murmured, uncertain now, the polished veneer of the debate cracked open by one man's refusal to play the game. And in that silence, J.D. Vance let his words stand, heavier than applause, louder than spin. The chamber had fallen into a tense quiet after J.D. Vance spoke. The contrast between Sherrod Brown's polished rhetoric and J.D.'s raw, human truth still echoed in the minds of those watching. But as J.D. stepped off the floor, his mind was anything but at rest. Back in his office, the glow of the Capitol lights framed his silhouette, and the weight of what he had shared felt heavier with every breath. That's when his aide entered, eyes wide with urgency, a manila folder clutched tight in both hands. Without a word, he set it down on the desk between them, the soft thud louder than it should have been. J.D. hesitated, then opened it. Inside were documents, copies of emails, payment records, and memos that painted a troubling picture. Sherrod Brown, the senator who had just spoken so passionately about smart trade and modern partnerships, was connected in ways no one had seen coming. The trail led directly to lobbyists for foreign steel conglomerates, companies that had profited from the flood of cheap imports J.D. had condemned just hours before. The emails weren't vague pleasantries or harmless correspondence. They spoke of meetings behind closed doors, promises of campaign support, and language that, though careful, was clear enough for J.D. to read the intent between the lines. It wasn't just policy, it was complicity. J.D. leaned back, the room spinning just slightly as the weight of it all sank in. His aide spoke softly, as if afraid to break the fragile moment. "Sir, if this gets out, it changes everything." And it would. J.D. knew it. To go public would mean pulling the mask off a colleague, a man whose career spanned decades, whose fall would be as loud as his rise had been steady. It would mean turning the debate from policy to scandal, from ideas to character. And it would mean making powerful enemies, not just Sherrod, but the networks that had protected him, the donors who backed him, the colleagues who preferred the comfort of the status quo. J.D. stared at the papers, feeling the storm they represented gathering just beyond the horizon of this quiet office. He stood, unable to sit with the weight of the choice before him. The office felt too small, too close. Without a word, he grabbed his coat and stepped out into the night. The city hummed as always, but J.D.'s path took him away from its noise, to a place where no cameras watched, no speeches echoed. The Steelworkers Memorial sat at the edge of the mall, small, simple, easily overlooked. A sculpture of a lunch pail, worn boots beside it, set on a base etched with names. Names of those lost not in battlefields abroad, but on the home front. Men and women who had built a nation and been forgotten by it. J.D. ran his fingers over the cold metal, the names rough beneath his touch. He thought of the suicides he'd read about, the poverty statistics he'd seen, the families who had slipped through the cracks. Faces rose in his memory, Frank at the mill, the men at the loading dock, the boy he had been, watching his father come home empty-handed. The question haunted him. Could he stay silent, knowing what he now knew? Could he let the polished speeches stand, knowing the truth behind them? Or was the cost of exposing it too great, not for him, but for the country, for the faith people still tried to place in their leaders? J.D. stood there a long time, the cold settling deep, the night thick with unspoken promises and the weight of choices no man wanted to make. But he knew one thing. The time for easy answers was over. Whatever came next, it would not be decided in comfort, but in truth. The night had grown colder by the time J.D. Vance left the Steelworkers Memorial, but the chill in the air felt light compared to the storm gathering inside him. The documents weighed on his mind like iron. He knew what they meant, and more importantly, he knew what they demanded of him. But the cost, he could see it as clearly as the Capitol dome shining in the distance. To stand and reveal what he had learned would not just tarnish Sherrod Brown. It would break the unspoken code of the chamber, pit him against colleagues, cost him allies he'd worked hard to gain. It could end his career before it truly began. Yet as JD walked the quiet streets back toward his office, the names from that memorial stayed with him. Men who had given everything, asked for nothing, and received betrayal in return. How could he do less? By dawn, his decision was made. JD arranged a meeting in a small windowless room in the basement of a union hall on the outskirts of town. No cameras, no press, just JD and a handful of labor leaders who had seen more broken promises than most men could stomach. The room smelled faintly of coffee and sweat, the kind of place where real deals were once made, where trust was forged over hard truths. The men greeted JD with nods, their faces aligned with years of worry and work. Frank was there, the same man from the mill, his handshake firm, but his eyes searching JD's face, as if to gauge whether he truly understood what he was about to do. JD laid the documents on the battered table between them, pages spread out like evidence in a trial. He spoke plainly without flourish, detailing what he'd found. Sherrod's connections, the deals made behind closed doors, the campaign funds tied to foreign steel interests. The room was silent, save for the creak of chairs as men leaned in, reading the proof for themselves. When JD finished, the silence stretched long, heavy with the weight of what this meant. Finally, Frank spoke, his voice low but steady. "We always knew. We just didn't have the proof. Now you do, and now you gotta do what we can't." Another man, his hands rough from decades of work, added quietly, "Do it for us, for our kids, for the ones who think no one's left to fight for them." JD nodded, the responsibility settling on his shoulders, solid and inescapable. He had come seeking their counsel, but he left with their blessing, and with it, their trust. The risk hadn't changed, but its worth had been made clear. This wasn't about politics, it wasn't about Sherrod, it was about a promise to people who had been abandoned too often, for too long. As word quietly spread among the unions and townsfolk that JD was preparing to take a stand, the mood in those forgotten places began to shift. It wasn't loud, not yet. It was a flicker of hope, fragile but real, mixing with the tension that had hung over them for years. In union halls, bars, and homes, people spoke in hushed tones about what might come, daring to believe that someone was finally willing to risk it all for them. JD felt it too, that quiet current of expectation, the sense that history had begun to move again. The battle lines were drawn, the risk was real, but some risks, JD knew, were worth taking, and this one he would not turn from. The morning of the debate arrived with a cold, brittle light that seemed to sharpen every edge of the Capitol. JD Vance rose before dawn, sleep having offered little refuge, and dressed in quiet resolve. As he made his way toward the chamber, he chose a longer path, one that led him past the marble statues of leaders long gone, but not forgotten. Their faces carved in stone, bore down with solemnity, eyes forever fixed on the ideals they had once fought for. JD felt their silent gaze, and for a fleeting moment he wondered what they might think of the battle he was about to wage. Would they see a man ready to honor their legacy, or one foolish enough to challenge the machinery of power at great personal cost? He exhaled slowly, the cold morning air stinging his lungs, and kept walking. The Capitol's great doors opened before him, the echoes of his steps joining the murmur of the building as it came to life. Staffers hurried down corridors, papers rustling, voices low but charged with anticipation. The Senate chamber itself seemed to hum with the energy of what was to come. The desks gleamed under the lights, nameplates polished, microphones adjusted, everything staged for the performance that was about to unfold. But this was no ordinary session. The weight of expectation clung to the walls like the chill of the morning air. JD could feel it in the glances exchanged by aides, the tight smiles of colleagues, the quiet before the storm that everyone sensed but few dared name. Beyond the chamber, beyond the stone and steel of Washington, millions of Americans were already tuned in. News networks framed the day as pivotal, their graphics ablaze with banners. Senate showdown, Vance versus Brown. And talking heads speculated endlessly on outcomes, alliances, and fallout. In Ohio, in the heart of steel country, union halls and bars filled early. Men and women gathered around aging televisions, cups of black coffee or cheap beer in hand, their faces lined with hope, anger, fatigue, and something more fragile: belief. In quiet homes, families huddled together, children silenced by the tension in the room, sensing that what their parents watched mattered in ways they couldn't yet grasp. Outside the Capitol, the air crackled with the voices of steelworkers who had come from towns JD knew by heart. They stood shoulder to shoulder, banners held high against the pale sky. Protect American jobs. Steel built this country. Don't sell us out. Their breath rose in clouds, their boots planted firm on ground they claimed as their own, if only for this day. JD caught sight of them through a narrow window as he entered the chamber. For a moment, the din of the city faded, replaced by the memory of the mill, of his father's weary eyes, of promises made and broken. He carried them with him as he took his seat. The chamber began to fill, the buzz rising as senators arrived, as reporters scribbled notes, as cameras rolled to capture every glance, every word, every silence that might shape the story of the day. JD sat quietly, hands folded, eyes on the podium where soon he would stand. The storm was near now, so near he could feel it in the air, in the taut faces around him, in the beat of his own heart. This was the calm, the last breath before the fight began. The chamber grew still as JD Vance rose from his seat. The murmur of conversation faded, the soft shuffle of papers ceased, and the bright lights seemed to burn hotter as all eyes turned toward him. He approached the podium with measured steps, as if the weight of what he carried demanded a steady hand and a calm heart. For a moment he simply stood there, hands resting on the polished wood, gaze sweeping the room. His voice, when it came, was quiet. So quiet that the first rows of senators leaned forward to catch his words. Colleagues, I rise today not to debate a theory, but to present a truth. JD spoke of Harrison Mills, of fathers who had carried empty lunch pails home, of towns where the lights in the mills went out and never came back on. His voice grew stronger with each word, not from anger, but from conviction, until it filled the chamber and echoed beneath the dome. We have heard speeches today about smart trade and modern economy, he said, eyes briefly resting on Sherrod Brown. But I ask you, smart for whom? Modern for whom? At what cost? And to whose children? Then he reached beneath the podium and laid out the manila folder, the one that had kept him awake at night, the one that could change everything. With slow, deliberate motions, JD drew out document after document, holding them up for the chamber and the cameras. Tax break agreements signed in ink, payments routed through channels meant to hide their origin, and then the emails, the heart of it all. The chamber held its breath as JD read aloud. His voice was clear, unflinching. We'll make sure this deal slides through quietly. The words, Sherrod's words, hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The reaction was instant, and it was electric. A gasp rippled through the Senate floor, as real and raw as if a storm had cracked open the roof. Reporters in the press gallery scrambled for their notepads, their cameras, their phones, anything to capture the moment history shifted beneath their feet. Some senators stared in disbelief, others looked away, unwilling or unable to meet JD's gaze. Sherrod Brown sat motionless, his face drained of color, his mouth parted as if to speak, but no words came. His hands, so often animated in debate, lay still on the desk before him. The mask of confidence he had worn so easily now cracked, and beneath it lay a silence more damning than any denial. JD did not gloat. He did not raise his voice in triumph. Instead, he let the evidence speak, let the weight of those documents, of those words, do what needed to be done. His final glance around the chamber was not of victory but of resolve, of a man who had chosen a hard path because there was no other. Outside, the chants of steelworkers rose louder, their voices carrying through the marble walls. Voices JD had promised himself he would not fail. In that moment, it was not just a speech, not just a revelation. It was a reckoning. And the chamber, the nation watching, felt the ground shift beneath them. For a moment after JD's final word, the chamber stood frozen, as if no one dared move, as if the truth hanging in the air might shatter at the slightest sound. Then it began. A voice from across the aisle, Senator Harlan, a veteran lawmaker known for caution more than courage, rose above the stunned quiet. His tone was sharp, his face pale but resolute. "I move," he declared, his voice steady despite the tension, "that this body immediately refer these revelations for a formal ethics investigation. We owe that much to the American people." The words hit like a second lightning strike, shaking the chamber from stunned silence into uneasy motion. Some senators nodded, others exchanged glances, thick with calculation. Staffers leaned in, whispering behind raised hands, while reporters' pens raced across notepads, fingers tapped frantically at devices, and cameras zoomed in on the faces that would define this day. All eyes turned to Sherrod Brown. The man who had moments before stood as the voice of polished certainty now looked small beneath the dome's vast gaze. He rose, slow at first, then with a suddenness that betrayed his fraying composure. His voice, when it came, lacked the surety it once carried. "These accusations, these documents, they've been taken out of context," he stammered, eyes darting from one colleague to another, searching for a lifeline. "I never authorized, this was staff work, miscommunications, misunderstandings." But the words fell flat, each excuse thinner than the last, each denial swallowed by the weight of evidence JD had laid bare. Sherrod's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his desk, his mask of confidence broken beyond repair. Outside, the sound of protest swelled, filling the air even within the chamber's stone walls. The steel workers, the townspeople, those JD had invoked in his quiet fury, they had heard enough. "Sherrod sold us out!" they chanted, voices rough with anger, fists raised high, their cries a chorus of betrayal long endured and no longer silent. The chant echoed up the steps, through the doors, into the ears of the men and women who had long claimed to speak for them. Inside, some senators shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the sound, as if reminded suddenly that the people beyond these walls were real and listening. JD stood firm at his place, his hands resting lightly on the podium, his expression unreadable. He did not gloat, did not raise his voice to claim victory. He said little now because there was nothing more that needed saying. The truth he had carried into this chamber spoke louder than any speech could. It lived now in the stunned faces of his colleagues, in the shaken voice of Sherrod Brown, in the roar of protest beyond the marble walls. JD let that truth stand on its own, because truth, once revealed, needed no defense. It simply needed to be seen and felt and faced. And as the Senate turned, as the chamber shifted beneath the weight of what had been revealed, JD knew the real battle was just beginning. The storm he had summoned with his words and his courage would not pass quickly. But for the first time in a long time, he believed it might wash something clean. He stood still, steady, as the winds of change began to blow. The news didn't just break, it detonated. Within minutes of J.D. Vance's expose and the Senate's stunned turn, the nation's airwaves were saturated. Anchors interrupted scheduled programming, their voices tight with urgency, as graphics in bold red screamed across the bottom of screens. Breaking, Vance reveals Brown's secret ties to foreign steel lobby. Clips of J.D. at the podium, calm but fierce, played on endless loops while Sherrod Brown's stammered denials aired alongside, replayed so often they seemed to lose what little strength they'd had. Talk show panels assembled at record speed, analysts dissecting every word, every document J.D. had produced. And everywhere, the headlines echoed the same thunderous theme: betrayal, betrayal of trust, betrayal of workers, betrayal of the very people Sherrod Brown had long claimed to champion. In the steel towns of Ohio and beyond, where the mills had gone dark and the streets bore the scars of promises broken, the reaction was immediate and raw. Flags were pulled from cupboards and attics, not as decoration, but as declarations. They flew from porches, from picket fences, from the windows of trucks that rumbled through town squares. In union halls, workers pounded fists on tables, not in anger at each other, but in a shared fury at what had been done to them. The quiet bitterness that had long simmered beneath the surface now erupted into something louder, something that demanded to be seen and heard. Protesters poured into streets, their voices rising in chants that echoed the fury of generations. "Sherrod sold us out. Steel for America, not for sale." The banners they carried weren't polished or printed. They were handmade, painted on old bed sheets, scrawled on cardboard, the words raw and real like the men and women who bore them. Social media became a battlefield of its own. Hashtags surged to the top of trending lists within the hour. Hashtag Steel sold out. Hashtag Vance for the people. Hashtag Sherrod the sellout. Clips of JD's speech racked up millions of views, shared by factory workers, veterans, small-town mayors, and ordinary citizens who felt for once that someone had spoken for them. The comments told the story as powerfully as the footage. Finally, a man with guts in that chamber. We've been waiting for this for decades. JD Vance just did what no one else had the spine to do. Sherrod's defenders tried to push back, to argue nuance, to remind people of his long career, his past votes, his speeches. But the tide had turned, and it was swift. The truth had landed with the weight of a steel beam, and no amount of spin could lift it. In the Capitol, JD watched it all unfold, not with satisfaction, but with the sober understanding of what it meant. He had lit a fuse that could not be snuffed out, and the fire that followed would burn far beyond the walls of the Senate. It was no longer about one man or one vote. It was about a reckoning, a demand from the people that those who spoke in their name remember who they served. And as the chants rose beyond the marble steps, as the flags waved in streets that had too long felt forgotten, JD Vance stood silent, steady, knowing that what had begun could not be undone. The uprising was here. The outrage was real, and the fight had only just begun. Sherrod Brown's team moved swiftly, but not swiftly enough. Within hours of the expose shaking the Senate and igniting the streets, they scheduled a press conference, a bid to seize back control, to reframe the narrative before it slipped entirely from their grasp. The setting was carefully chosen, a stately room lined with flags, the podium gleaming beneath bright lights. Sherrod stepped up, his tie knotted tightly at his throat, his smile forced, too tight, betraying the strain beneath. Cameras clicked like gunfire as reporters leaned in, notebooks poised, mics extended, eyes sharp with the scent of blood in the water. Sherrod began with practiced calm. He thanked the press, spoke of unprecedented times, of misunderstandings that had been twisted into falsehoods. He blamed miscommunications, staff errors, paperwork that had been misread or taken out of context. At no point, he declared, did I knowingly engage in any arrangement that would harm American workers. My record speaks for itself. But the words felt hollow, the polish gone. The room was no longer an audience. It was a firing squad armed with questions. The first reporter cut in before Sherrod could finish his prepared remarks. Senator Brown, did you or did you not authorize meetings with foreign steel lobbyists while publicly advocating for American steel? Sherrod faltered, eyes narrowing as he searched for footing. I meet with many stakeholders. We have open dialogue with all sectors, but the reporter pressed again, and another joined in. What about the emails, Senator? Your words, we'll make sure this deal slides through quietly. Were you misquoted in your own correspondence? The room grew louder, the questions sharper, the tone more biting. Sherrod's answers came faster now, but they stumbled over each other, excuses layered upon deflections, none landing cleanly. His voice rose, trying to command, but instead it frayed at the edges, thin against the tide of doubt. Beyond the cameras, beyond the room, the collapse rippled outward. Allies who had once stood at his side now issued cautious statements, heavy on phrases like concerned by the allegations and awaiting the outcome of investigations. The phone calls that might have offered reassurance went unanswered. Donors, wary of the storm and the optics of scandal, quietly began pulling their support, their pledges withdrawn with polite but final words. Town halls that Sherrod once visited to polite applause now greeted him with folded arms and cold stares. Or worse, the anger that had once simmered beneath the surface now met him face to face. "Sold us out, Sherrod," someone shouted at one stop, the words sharp as any headline. "How much did our jobs cost you?" The jeers followed him as he tried to speak, drowning out his words, leaving him standing at the podium, isolated, a man once confident in his place, now adrift in the storm of his own making. Sherrod Brown had hoped to weather this as he had other storms, with charm, with careful words, with the machinery of politics to smooth the rough edges. But this storm was different. The truth, once loosed, had taken on a life of its own, carried on the voices of workers, of families, of a nation that felt betrayed. And no press conference, no denial, no shifting of blame could put it back in the box. As Sherrod stepped down from the podium, flashes of cameras burned his image into the public record. Not as a man defending his name, but as one watching it slip through his fingers. The vote came swiftly, almost brutally so, as if the Senate itself wanted to tear the bandage off in one decisive motion. The chamber, still heavy with the weight of J.D. Vance's revelations and Sherrod Brown's failed defense, moved to action. The motion was simple in its wording, but seismic in its consequence. Suspension pending formal ethics investigation. The final tally was read aloud, the clerk's voice clear, each syllable landing like a gavel strike. No applause followed, no one cheered. The gravity of what had transpired held the room in a kind of reverent silence, as if even the most hardened political figures understood they had just witnessed the unmaking of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Sherrod Brown stood as the result was announced, though his legs seemed reluctant to obey. His face, pale beneath the harsh chamber lights, betrayed no anger now, only the hollow look of someone who had seen the ground vanish beneath his feet. Two security officers approached, their movements respectful but firm. Sherrod nodded, the smallest gesture of resignation, and together they began the slow walk from his desk toward the chamber doors. Cameras snapped in word, capturing every step, every bowed head, every strained expression. The flashes lit his path like cruel spotlights, burning his image into the public consciousness as a man brought low, not by rumor, but by truth laid bare. Outside the chamber, the sea of reporters waited, a living wall of microphones, lenses, and relentless questions. Senator Brown, do you deny the charges? Will you resign outright? What do you say to the workers calling for your ouster? The voices blended into a single deafening roar, a storm of judgment that no statement could calm. Sherrod did not answer. He kept his eyes forward, his pace measured but heavy, as if each step carried the weight of his shattered career, his lost standing, his broken trust. The guards flanked him, guiding him through the crush of bodies as cameras tracked his every move, beaming the spectacle into homes, bars, and union halls across the nation. The man who had spoken so often of loyalty to workers, of commitment to justice, now walked through a gauntlet of his own making. Each flash a reminder of what had been exposed. J.D. Vance stood at the rear of the chamber, his hands folded loosely before him, watching the scene unfold. He said nothing. There was no triumph in his gaze, no satisfaction in his bearing. This was not the victory of a man who had sought to destroy, but the fulfillment of a duty no one else had dared to claim. He watched as Sherrod disappeared beyond the chamber doors, swallowed by the sea of press, of consequence, of history being written in real time. The chants from beyond the Capitol steps filtered faintly through the thick walls. Voices that had once trusted Sherrod now called for justice, for change, for something better. J.D. drew a slow breath, his mind already turning to what came next. The truth had done its work, but the fight was far from over. There were bills yet to pass, towns yet to rebuild, promises yet to be kept. He stepped away from the chamber's shadowed edge and into the light that streamed through the tall windows, ready to face what the morning would bring. For now, though, he allowed himself one final glance at the path Sherrod had taken, the path where power and betrayal had met their reckoning. And then, J.D. Vance turned to the work that remained. The Capitol had long since fallen silent, its grand halls emptied of voices, its lights dimmed against the weight of the night. J.D. Vance sat alone in his office, the glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across piles of folders and dog-eared notebooks. The noise of the day, the gasps in the chamber, the roar of protest outside, the relentless snap of camera shutters had faded, but their echoes remained in the stillness. J.D.'s tie lay undone on his desk, his jacket draped across the back of a chair, forgotten as his eyes traced the familiar lines of stories he had read too many times to count. These were not speeches or policy briefs. They were letters from steelworkers, from widows, from sons and daughters of the towns that had built a nation and been left to rust. Some were written in neat cursive, others in shaky print, all bearing the same heavy truths. JD reread them now, as if searching for reassurance or perhaps forgiveness. Each story was a reminder of why he had done what he had done. The manila folder on his desk, the one that had held the documents exposing Sherrod Brown's betrayal, was now closed, pushed to the corner, as if distance could dull its weight. JD's hand rested lightly on a letter he had carried in his pocket that day, creased and worn from his fingers, brushing it for strength. It was from a retired mill foreman in Steubenville. "We don't ask for much," the letter said. "Just a fair shake. Just someone to see us." JD had thought of those words when he stood at the podium, when he revealed the truths that no one else would. And now, in the quiet, they echoed louder than any cheer could. There was no joy in what had happened, no satisfaction in seeing a colleague fall, no thrill in the headlines that bore his name beside words like hero, whistleblower, truth teller. JD felt only the heavy truth that what had to be done had been done, and that its cost was real. He thought of Sherrod, of the look in his eyes as the vote was read, as the guards led him away. JD had not wanted that. He had wanted honesty, accountability, change. But sometimes the price of truth was higher than anyone wished to pay. The room felt colder now, the city outside as quiet as the steel towns JD carried in his heart. He looked out the window at the Capitol dome, its light pale against the dark sky, and wondered how many had sat as he did now, alone, uncertain, but bound by duty. His fingers drifted over the stack of letters, pausing on one, then another, each name, each story, a thread in the fabric of the fight he had chosen. JD closed his eyes for a moment, drew a slow breath, and felt the weariness of a man who had not sought this path, but who could not turn from it. Outside, the first faint glow of dawn touched the edge of the horizon, a promise of the work yet to come. And as JD sat in that quiet office, he understood that the true weight of what had been done was not measured in votes or headlines, but in the hope of those who still waited to see if their stories mattered. That, he knew, was a burden worth carrying. The dawn that had begun as a faint glow outside J.D. Vance's window now stretched fully across the land, casting soft light over towns that had long lived in shadow. In one of those towns, small, forgotten by most, but never by J.D., the gates of a steel mill creaked open once more. There were no cameras to record the moment, no reporters to script it into a headline, no politicians to claim credit. The reopening was quiet, almost reverent, as if the mill itself understood that its return was less about celebration and more about restoration. The air smelled of oil and metal, of work waiting to be done, and of promise, fragile but real. J.D. arrived unannounced, his car pulling up to the lot where grass had begun to push through the cracks in the pavement. The men and women gathered there looked up in surprise as he stepped out. Not the senator in polished shoes and tailored suits they might have imagined, but a man in scuffed boots and rolled sleeves who had come not to speak, but to stand with them. He crossed the lot slowly, taking in the sight of the mill's smokestacks rising against the morning sky, the faint hum of machinery stirring to life inside. The sound was like a heartbeat returning after too long a silence. There was no stage, no speeches, just J.D. walking among the workers, offering his hand, feeling the calluses of men who had waited too long to feel useful again. They shook his hand firmly, their eyes meeting his with a mix of gratitude and disbelief, as if still unsure whether this was truly happening or just another promise destined to fade. J.D. said little. He had spoken enough in the chamber. Here words seemed small beside the sight of sparks flying again, of forklifts rumbling over ground that had been still for far too long. One man lingered as the others returned to their posts, his cap pulled low, his face lined with years of worry. He took J.D.'s hand in both of his, gripping it with quiet intensity. His voice was low, meant for J.D. alone. "You gave us our lives back." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of all the speeches J.D. had ever written, all the battles he had fought. J.D. held the man's gaze, saw in it the reflection of every worker, every family, every town that had been left behind, and was now, at last, remembered. He nodded once, unable to trust his voice against the tide of emotion rising in his chest. The work began in earnest as JD stepped back, watching as the men and women moved with purpose, as the mill came alive, not with fanfare, but with the honest sound of labor reclaimed. The clatter of tools, the hiss of steam, the rhythm of boots on concrete, all of it spoke louder than any broadcast ever could. JD knew there would be more fights ahead, more nights spent in solitude weighing hard choices, more storms to weather. But here in this moment, he saw what made it worth the cost. Hope forged anew, not in speeches or slogans, but in the hands of those who built and rebuilt this country. And as he turned to leave, JD felt the sun on his face, warm against the chill that had clung to him for so long. The mill's hum followed him, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are the quietest of all. The hum of the reopened mill still echoed in JD Vance's mind as he returned to his office. But so did the storm that followed his choice. Truth, he was learning, came at a price. The backlash was swift, sharp, and unrelenting. His inbox filled with messages not of gratitude, but of warning. Anonymous emails spat threats cloaked in vague menace. Phone calls came at odd hours, voices on the other end thick with contempt or thinly veiled intimidation. Political allies who had once praised JD's courage in private now distanced themselves in public, their statements careful, their smiles colder. Donors withdrew support with polite words that stung more than insults. "We respect your convictions, Senator, but we must consider our position." The quiet corridors of power where JD had once walked with purpose now felt narrower, lined with faces that turned away as he passed. But if the powerful recoiled, the people reached out. Letters began arriving by the dozen, then by the hundred, handwritten and typed, folded with care or hastily scrawled, their envelopes smudged by work-stained hands. They came from steelworkers and their families, from veterans who had worn their own armor of duty, from mothers and fathers, sons and daughters of towns JD had never even set foot in, but now felt he knew. Each letter bore a piece of the truth he had fought for. Gratitude, relief, a glimmer of hope reignited in hearts grown weary from disappointment. He read them at night, when the office was empty and the city's noise faded, their words filling the silence with something stronger than any speech he could give. Some letters were long, recounting decades of struggle and loss, the slow erosion of faith in leaders who spoke of duty and delivered neglect. Others were brief, but no less powerful. One in particular JD kept on his desk. The paper creased and soft at the edges from his fingers, tracing its lines. It came from a retired machinist in Youngstown, written in careful block letters, as if each word carried the weight of the writer's pride. "For the first time, we felt seen." 7 simple words, but they held more meaning than all the threats, all the backlash combined. JD would glance at that letter in his quiet moments, drawing strength from it, a reminder of why the hard path had been the only path. The cost of truth was real, and JD bore it without illusion. He knew the fights ahead would be no easier, the opposition no softer, the risks no smaller. But he also knew that what had been set in motion could not be undone. Not by politics, not by power, not by fear. He stood in the window of his office late into the night, the city stretching before him, its lights flickering like distant stars. Behind those lights were people whose names he would never know, but whose trust, fragile and hard-won, he now carried as surely as any burden. And as dawn began its slow climb over the Capitol, JD understood that the cost of truth was high, but the cost of silence had always been higher. The Capitol chamber was full once more, but the mood was different this time. Gone was the tension of accusation, the undercurrent of scandal that had gripped the nation. In its place was something quieter, steadier, a resolve that had grown not from speeches or slogans, but from the undeniable power of truth. JD Vance sat at his desk, the folded letter that had sustained him through the storm tucked safely in his breast pocket. As the clerk began to read the roll call, JD's gaze swept the room, taking in faces that now met his with respect, some grudging, others genuine, but all shaped by what had transpired. The American Steel and Worker Protection Act was no longer just a bill. It had become a symbol, a line drawn in defense of those too often forgotten. One by one, the votes were cast, the ayes ringing out louder than the nays, building like the slow rise of a tide. As the tally grew, it became clear that the measure would pass, not by a narrow margin, but by overwhelming support. Members who had once hesitated, wary of controversy or political risk, now raised their voices in favor, some inspired, others compelled by the undeniable force of public demand. The chamber, so often a theater of gridlock and cautious calculation, for once moved with purpose. When the final count was announced, the room stirred not with applause, but with the quiet recognition that history had been made, not by thunderous speeches or grand gestures, but by hard truth and harder choices. J.D. did not rise, did not raise his fist in victory. He simply bowed his head for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment settle into him. The work was not finished. The bill's passage was not an end, but a beginning. But it was a beginning hard won, and he allowed himself a single, deep breath of relief before the next fight began. Outside the Capitol, word spread like wildfire. News banners flashed. Steel Protection Act approved, a victory for American workers. In steel towns and small communities across the country, bells rang in union halls. Workers embraced, and for the first time in a long while, hope outweighed cynicism. J.D.'s stand sparked more than one victory. Across the country, legislatures in other states began drafting their own versions of the bill, inspired by what had been accomplished. Governors who had once dismissed protection measures as outdated now called special sessions, eager to show solidarity with the workers whose voices could no longer be ignored. The movement that had begun with a single speech, a single risk, now rippled outward, turning J.D.'s fight into something larger than himself. In the press, they called it a turning point. On social media, hashtags like #SteelStrong and #VanceVictory trended for days. But in the union halls and the quiet kitchens of working families, it wasn't about politics or slogans. It was about the simple, powerful truth that someone had stood up, and because he did, the ground had shifted beneath their feet. J.D. left the chamber quietly, stepping into the cool air beyond its stone walls. The Capitol dome loomed above, bathed in the pale light of late afternoon, and he paused, letting the moment settle, feeling both the weight and the promise of what came next. The bill had passed, but the work of justice was far from done, and J.D. Vance was ready. The passage of the American Steel and Worker Protection Act had not just shifted policy, it had stirred something deeper, something long dormant. Across the country, in towns where factories had once been the beating heart of community life, people emerged from the long shadows of disappointment and resignation. Streets that had known more silence than song now echoed with the sound of marching feet. Workers, veterans, teachers, farmers, men and women who had grown used to being overlooked, filled the streets, their banners bold, their voices rising in unison. American jobs for American workers. Fair trade, fair future. The chants carried far beyond the town squares, carried by news cameras, shared in live streams, spreading the movement that J.D. Vance's stand had sparked. These were no longer just protests. They were calls to action, demands for lasting change that could not be ignored. In town halls that had once stood half empty during council meetings, crowds now packed every seat, lined the walls, filled the doorways. People came not to complain, but to contribute, to speak of what could be done, of what must be done. They spoke of new apprenticeships, of rebuilding main streets, of holding leaders accountable, not just with votes, but with vigilance. Local officials who had grown used to disinterest now found themselves facing a new, energized citizenry, one that would no longer accept empty promises or polite excuses. J.D. heard of these gatherings through letters, through news reports, through quiet messages passed to him by union leaders who smiled with something close to wonder. "You started this," they told him, "and it's only just begun." But it wasn't the headlines or the slogans that stayed with J.D. most. It was what he saw on a visit to a plant that had reopened its gates just weeks after the bill's passage. There were no cameras that day, no official ceremonies or ribbon cuttings. JD arrived quietly, stepping out onto the lot where workers gathered for their shift change. The air smelled of oil and steel, of work honest and hard. And there, as the afternoon sun glinted off new machinery, he saw them, the children. They stood at the edge of the lot, small hands clutching little American flags, their faces alight with something JD hadn't seen in far too long. Hope, unguarded and pure. They waved as the workers filed in, as their parents, uncles, and neighbors walked with purpose once more. JD met their eyes, raised a hand in return, and felt the warmth of that simple gesture settle into him, deeper than any applause ever could. The moment was small, but it carried the weight of everything he had fought for. Here was the future that had felt so fragile, now standing firm on its own feet. JD stayed only a short while, long enough to shake hands, to listen, to offer quiet words of encouragement. Then he left, letting the workers claim the moment for themselves, as it should be. As his car pulled away, JD glanced back one last time, watching as the flags fluttered in the breeze, as the mill's hum rose to meet the sky. The nation had awoken, not with fanfare or spectacle, but with the steady heartbeat of people reclaiming their place in its story. The cheers of the crowds, the ringing of bells in union halls, and the hopeful waving of small flags gradually faded into memory as J.D. Vance turned his focus to the work that lay beyond the headlines. He understood, perhaps more keenly than anyone, that true change was not sealed by the passage of a bill or the signing of a law. It had to be carried forward in quiet rooms, on long nights, in conversations that never made the evening news. And so J.D. began what he knew would be the harder fight, building a movement not of slogans, but of substance. He started small. There were no cameras, no podiums, no grand declarations. J.D. met with community leaders in modest town halls where the floors creaked with age and the walls bore the faded portraits of mayors and sheriffs long gone. He sat at folding tables in union offices where the smell of coffee and old wood filled the air, and listened to men and women who knew what it meant to struggle, to rebuild, to hope, and to hurt. He gathered with veterans in American Legion halls, their service medals tucked in drawers but their sense of duty sharp as ever. These meetings were not for show. They were for planning, for listening, for charting a path that belonged to all, not to one man's name or ambition. Again and again, J.D. made his position clear. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice steady, his eyes firm. "It never was. It's about making sure they're never forgotten again." And when he said they, everyone knew who he meant. The workers who had built towns from the ground up and watched them fall, the families who had weathered layoffs, closures, and empty promises, the children who deserved more than inherited disappointment. His words weren't polished or rehearsed, but they rang true, and those who heard them felt the difference. J.D. wasn't asking for loyalty. He was offering partnership. Slowly, steadily, the movement grew, not through viral clips or trending hashtags, but through trust rebuilt where trust had been lost. Local committees formed to oversee fair hiring at reopened plants. Towns organized task forces to invest in apprenticeships and trade schools. Veterans groups joined with unions to advocate for infrastructure projects that would bring both dignity and jobs. And through it all, J.D. remained in the background, refusing credit, deflecting praise, keeping the spotlight on the people who had waited too long to be seen. There were no easy victories in this phase, no dramatic votes or sweeping speeches, but in its quiet way, it was the most important battle of all. J.D. knew the road ahead would be long, the challenges many, the opposition fierce. But as he stood once more at the window of his office, looking out over a city still learning to listen to the voices it had ignored, he felt the quiet strength of a cause greater than any one man. The battle beyond politics had begun, and this time it belonged to the people. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the classroom windows, casting warm patches of light on the desks where students sat in quiet anticipation. Their civics teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, moved to the front of the room, a laptop open and ready. Today's lesson wasn't from a textbook. It was a real moment from recent history. She clicked play, and J.D. Vance's speech filled the room, his voice steady and sincere, speaking of steel towns, lost jobs, and the fight for justice. The students listened, some leaning forward, eyes wide, others quietly reflecting. The weight of JD's words hung in the air long after the video ended. Silence settled over the classroom until a young boy raised his hand hesitantly. "Can I be like him one day?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with hope. Mrs. Reynolds smiled, her eyes meeting his. "If you choose to be," she replied gently, "courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you decide to carry every day." J.D. Vance stood up when it mattered most, not because it was easy, but because he believed someone had to. Around the room, nods of understanding spread. The lesson went beyond politics or speeches. It was about the power of choice, of standing for something greater. And in that classroom, a seed had been planted, a seed of possibility and responsibility. Before the sun fully rose over the city, J.D. Vance stepped out onto the cool marble steps of the Capitol. The early morning air was crisp, carrying a quiet stillness that seemed to hold the weight of all the moments that had passed within these walls. As he looked up, the American flag slowly unfurled against the pale sky, its colors vivid and unwavering. JD's thoughts drifted, not to the applause or headlines that had followed him, but to something deeper. Not for applause, for what's right. The words echoed softly in his mind, a reminder that the battles fought were never about personal glory, but about the lives and hopes of those who could not speak for themselves. His fingers instinctively touched the steel pin on his lapel, the one he always wore, the symbol of the workers, the towns, and the families who had been at the heart of his fight. It was more than a piece of metal. It was a pledge, a silent vow to carry their stories forward, no matter the cost. As the flag rose higher, catching the first rays of sunlight, JD stood still, feeling both the enormity of what had been achieved and the journey still ahead. The Capitol around him was waking up, but in that moment, time seemed to pause, a quiet victory in a world so often filled with noise. He took a slow breath, steady and sure, and stepped forward. The path was long, and the work never truly finished. But as long as he carried that pin and the weight of those stories, JD knew he would keep walking, guided not by applause, but by the quiet strength of doing what was right. As the day wound down and the Capitol's shadows lengthened, J.D. Vance settled into the quiet of his office, a microphone before him and a simple message ready to be shared. He began to speak, his voice calm but resolute. "We don't save a nation with noise. We save it with courage." These words carried the weight of all he had witnessed and fought for. The silent struggles of steel towns, the hopes of families, the battles fought not for applause but for justice. He spoke not to rouse a crowd or command attention, but to remind everyone listening that true change comes from steadfast bravery and unwavering commitment. The noise of politics and scandal fades, but courage endures. This was a call to all who heard him to stand firm, to act with integrity, to remember those who had been forgotten. As his message ended, JD turned off the microphone and looked out the window. Dawn was breaking over Washington, casting golden light across the city's monuments and the Capitol dome. The light spilled into the room, filling it with a quiet promise. JD rose and walked toward the window, his silhouette framed by the glow. He faced the new day with a steady heart, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The story was far from over, but in that moment there was hope, born not from loud proclamations, but from the courage to do what is right, no matter the cost. This story reminds us that true leadership is not about loud words or fleeting fame, but about courage and commitment to those often forgotten. J.D. Vance's journey shows how standing for justice, even when the cost is high, can spark real change and hope. It's a powerful call to each of us to act with integrity and never lose sight of the people we serve. What small act of courage can you take today to make a difference in your community? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.